Okay, let's start looking at the gross anatomy of the bone. Primarily, it's going to be of a long bone. Okay, so let's look at the primary features. I'm going to go through a couple different pictures here that will best represent what we're looking at. So here we have in the picture an example of a long bone. This happens to be the femur on this one. And what you're looking at, the first thing that we want to see is your dominant feature of a long bone is the shaft in the center. So here we're looking at basically from here down to this area and in between. This is known as the shaft of the bone, or also called the diaphysis. So when we're looking at this, that's going to be diaphysis, and that's just the long shaft of a long bone. The shaft functions, it provides leverage for movement, and it also allows for weight bearing, so it can withstand some compressive forces. Internal into the long bone, we see that this is kind of a hollowed area in this space, and that's called, or that inner space of a long bone, that's called the medullary cavity on here. So that's the medullary cavity, which is your internal portion of the diaphysis of a long bone. Now, the medullary cavity is what contains some of the bone marrow, depending on your age. If you're a child or young, you're looking at that's going to be red marrow, and then when you become an adult, then in that transitions over to yellow marrow. And yellow marrow, as we said earlier, is for energy reserves, and it's basically lipids or fat. Okay, so that inner part is going to be medullary cavity. Towards the ends of the bone, we see that we have this knobby portion at the end, okay? And the ends of the bone are known as the epiphysis. And it's a knobby end, okay? So the end of the bone that is proximal or closest to the trunk of the body is called your proximal side, or the proximal epiphysis. The knobby end that is furthest away from the trunk of the body is known as your distal epiphysis. Now the bone, the long bone, the outer portions of this, as you can see on here, and as well as this space here, okay, this is all compact bone, okay. Deep to this, let me change a little bit of a color here so you can see, you can see the different structures in this area. That's much more of a porous area, so that's going to be the spongy bone on this one. Now the sponginess on here, which is going to be within the epiphysis, both proximal and distal, allows for stress resistance, or it resists stress in multiple directions, okay? It also contains marrow, bone marrow in these areas. The next thing we want to look at, so that's the proximal and distal epiphysis. Now in between, let me back this one up. Let me get rid of some of that color. Okay, in between this area, and you can't really see it on here. I'll show you another picture. It's going to be something that occurs right in this area, and that's going to be the metathesis. I don't believe it's written on this one. We'll show you a different picture from this one. I'll tell you what, let's go to it right now. Let me get this one. Okay, so here we just have a different vantage point of the a long bone. Here we're going to have, oops, let me go to here. Here we're going to have your proximal epiphysis. We're going to have the diaphysis in the center, distal epiphysis down here. Let me get rid of some of those colors on this. Okay. The metaphysis, what I was looking at, is in between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. So we're looking at this area roughly in this area. That's going to be the metaphysis. That's a little low on that. And it's going to contain the growth plate. Let's back this up, get rid of some of those colors. okay? So you can see this line right here, okay? You can see that line, so let me get rid of that color again. You can see that line, that's known as the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate. The epiphyseal plate is your growth plate, and that allows for the bone to lengthen. Now, once you become an adult and the bones are no longer, and you're not getting taller, and the bones fuse, that growth plate or the epiphyseal plate becomes the epiphyseal line. Okay, so there's no longer growing in this area. So the metathesis is located between the the metathesis is located between the epiphysis and the diaphysis. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is going to be the periosteum. Let me go back to this picture here. No, we don't have a good picture on that one. So let's just go with this one, okay? So let's look at the periosteum. If you look at the bone, you can see this layer that's coming off on this one. They just kind of peel it away. This peeling, this outer lining of the bone is made up of dense regular connective tissue. It surrounds the entire bone except for the surface that articulates, or the articulating surface, which is kind of all through this area and down here, okay? That's the articulating surface, and you do not have any periosteum on there. Now, the periosteum has two different layers. So if we look down at this bottom picture, bottom right-hand picture, we're looking at the periosteum, which is from here out to this portion. Okay, so this is the periosteum in this area. The outer portion is the fibrous layer. Okay, and this is dense regular connective tissue. And this outer layer provides an attachment or anchors blood vessels and nerves to the surface of the bone. It also provides the attachment site for tendons and ligaments. Inside, let me change my color here. Let's go to green on this one. On the inner side, just that inner layer, as you can see, that's coming around. That is your cellular layer. So the outer portion is your fibrous layer. The inner layer is your cellular layer. And the cellular layer, it's going to contain different types of cells. The different cells, and we're going to get into this when we get into more detail on another presentation here, in either the next one or the one after that. Those are going to contain cells that are called osteoprogenitor cells. They're going to also have cells that are called osteoblast and osteoclast cells. And again, another video will go into those a little bit more detail. If we were to magnify in, I don't know if I can magnify in on this one too much. I don't think so. When we're looking at the next thing, the periosteum, we've said, allows for an anchoring site for blood vessels and nerves, and it allows for attachment for ligaments and tendons on the outer surface of this. So that's going to be on this is where it would attach over here. Now the periosteum has to anchor to the underlying bone. So this area, let me go to blue on this one just to change up the colors. All of this is going to be the bone tissue itself, and we'll go into that in more specific detail a little bit later. We're going to be seeing these little fibers here, okay? Those little fibers are called perforating fibers, also known as Sharpie's fibers. And those fibers anchor the periosteum to the bone. So think of it as like Velcro, okay? These are collagen fibers, and they run perpendicular to the diaphysis. So perpendicular, they're going to be kind of coming out this way, and that's how it attaches to the bone, okay? So those are perforating or Sharpie's fibers. They're made out of collagen, and it anchors the periosteum to the bone. The endosteum, let's look at, tell you what, let me get rid of some of these colors here. Let me, oops, I can't do that. back that one up. Looks like I'm not going to do that right away. So let's look at the endosteum. So we've talked about what the periosteum is. Let's do purple. Okay. What we've talked about the periosteum is runs on the outside of the bone except for the articular surface area or the articular cartilage. The endosteum, okay, the endosteum lines the internal surfaces of the medullary cavity. Now, we said in the other picture that the medullary cavity is going to be this space, and the medullary cavity contains the red or yellow marrow, depending on your situation. So it's going to be lining the endosteum. And what this contains, the endosteum contains the different types of cells as well. Osteoprogenitor cells, cells that are going to lead to the formation of bone. Osteoblast as well as osteoclast cells. So those are going to be the different cells found on the endosteum. So periosteum lines the outside of the bone except for the articular surfaces. Endosteum lines the internal medullary cavity. Another thing that we're going to be looking at, let's look at the flat bone on here. Let's get rid of this picture, go to this picture. I think that picture. There we go. Okay, so here's a picture of a flat bone on this one. And for the most part, they have a lot of similarities to the long bone. You're going to have on the exterior or the interior surface, this is going to be the compact bone or the dense bone. You can see that if this is the exterior surface, this is the interior lining of this. Both are going to be made up of compact bone, and they're pretty much parallel to each other in this case. Between the outer and inner surfaces, in between, you're going to see all of this structure, and then that's the spongy bone. Okay, you will notice that flat bones do not have a medullary cavity, and the spongy bone, just like everything else in anatomy, we're going to give this a different name as well. The spongy bone in a flat bone is also known as a diploe, D-I-P-L-O-E. Okay, so that's spongy bone, or another name for spongy bone in a flat bone. The next part, let me pause this and figure out what the next part is. Okay, now that I figured out where we're at, I spoke earlier of yellow marrow and red marrow, and the differences between the two is red marrow is what is making blood cells on this one. In children, most of the bones will have red marrow, and as you age, it transitions over into yellow marrow. And what we're looking at, let's go to this, and let's look at the differences where we're finding the differences between red marrow and yellow marrow. So let's look at red, since we're going to be dealing with adults primarily. So if we're looking at red marrow, this is where you're finding all the things highlighted in blue. This is where you find red marrow. So you're going to be looking at the flat bones of the skull. You're going to be looking at the sternum, ribs, and the pelvis. That's where you're going to typically find the red marrow. Yellow marrow, you're going to be finding primarily in the long bones for an adult. So you're going to find that in the shafts or the diaphysis of the humerus, the radius ulna, femur, and so forth. Okay? So let's, one more thing before we're done here. Let's look at, what do we want to do on here? Let's look at the blood supply. So which slide do I want to do with this one? So let's do, I'm trying to see here. Well, I guess this slide will do. Okay, we'll do as good as any. When we're looking at the bone is made up of living cells, and those cells will need nutrients. It needs to be innervated. And how those cells, how the bone receives nutrition is through the blood supply and innervation. And what we can see, we've got blood vessels. Whoops. We have blood vessels here, okay, that enter the bone, okay. Now, bone is highly vascularized, especially the spongy bone, okay. That's where red blood cells are being made. So we have to have a good blood supply there in which to then get into your blood vessels. But those blood vessels will enter into the bone through what's called a nutrient foramen. Okay, so those enter, so those holes, okay, will be a nutrient foramen. Okay, and if you recall from the table that I told you, you had to learn certain terminology. A foramen is essentially a hole. Okay, so this is a nutrient hole in this one. Typically, you're going to just have one blood vessel, an artery, a vein that enters and leaves the bone, and then you're going to have the nerve that follows it as well. The nerve supply that goes to the bone, typically just sensory. There's not a lot of motor function associated within the bone itself, and it just signals the body for injuries to your skeletal system. Okay, so this is your basic layout of your bone on this one, and then we're going to be going into the microscopic components.